Hello everybody and welcome to a special video here today because we are not going to be doing the typical general fantasy news, but instead hyper-focusing on one specific fantasy news story that dropped this week. I briefly touched on this in the last episode of Fantasy News that was hosted by Murphy Napier in a cut-in at the beginning, but I want to give my full thoughts on the current state of the Lord of the Rings IP and why my feelings on the headlines we have seen in just the last week are so negative, which is a bit atypical for me to do here. I usually try and find these silver linings or possible best case scenarios for all kinds of stories here because I know fans tend to get excited. But when I hear that people are planning to give Lord of the Rings the Star Wars treatment, it makes me basically just nauseous. That might seem overdramatic, but please keep in mind that this is a series that is incredibly special to me, and it is okay for people to get really passionate about the things they deeply care about. And yes, this could absolutely, in some miraculous chance, result in a ton of great Lord of the Rings adaptations. But is that really likely? The number one thing I have seen in response to this when people are talking about, hey, actually be positive, this could be good, is the idea that yes, it is just a money-making endeavor, but so is all filmmaking in the history of filmmaking. So why should you have any different expectation here? Because that is absolutely not true. Yes, making money on the studio level is why movies are made, but you need to look no further than the Lord of the Rings franchise itself to see that passionate filmmakers who really want to get a film made from the ground level up is also a completely valid and interesting part of filmmaking history, and one that seems to be completely absent on this soulless corporate buyout of an angle of the Lord of the Rings IP. Mike Flanagan, for the better part of a decade, has been actively campaigning to do some kind of adaptation for Dark Tower because he knows, understands, and loves that series and has a specific vision to give something to the fans they will love. And we're going to get into many more angles than just the business level later on, including just like the themes of Lord of the Rings and the potential of what kind of adaptation could still be done. But first, let's talk about the fact that this is just Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema buying a sliver of the IP from the Embracer Group, who has a larger set of the Lord of the Rings rights, and saying they're just going to start giving it the Star Wars treatment. And there's two angles to this point that I want to get into. First of which is that I understand there are massive Star Wars fans out there, and I think Star Wars ebbs and flows in qualities. Sometimes you get an Andor, other times you get Rogue One. And there are fans to all of those entries, and that's totally valid. But I cannot stress this enough, especially if you're someone who's not super familiar with these two series on their origin level. Star Wars and Lord of the Rings are entirely conceptually different into what makes them interesting and special for fans. Star Wars is kind of this infinite sprawling galaxy where, yeah, it certainly started with George Lucas, but for decades now, it has a legacy of having creative input from all kinds of minds, expanding the timelines deep in directions that just go far beyond his initial conception of the original trilogy. Fans are comfortable with that. They are extraordinarily okay with it, and you can continue to dump in new characters, ideas, whole factions into the Star Wars universe, and they feel like they fit. You have to fuck up pretty gargantuanly within the Star Wars universe to insert something that doesn't feel like it could belong in a planet in some solar system somewhere. There's not this really grand thematic cohesion. There's general ideas of good and bad, but yeah, it's not the most complicated or specific series of all time. Lord of the Rings debatably is. This is a story that, yes, has had other authors come in and look at Tolkien's leftover writings and then try and expand or put some cohesive bits together to put out additional work. But please understand, it is still entirely the creative work of one mind with a specific set of ideas behind it that tell a story with a definitive beginning and end. And the bar for the level of writing that takes place from the Silmarillion to the Hobbit and the trilogy and the writings after is incredibly high. And so when you see a company come in and say, we're going to give it the Star Wars treatment, the baggage that comes along with that idea is immense. And in my opinion, antithetical to the foundation of the Lord of the Rings series and why it is important and even influential. You can go watch the Lord of the Rings breakdown I did here, where I get into Tolkien's life and the ideas behind the Lord of the Rings a little bit more specifically, but I want to move on from that literary angle and talk about another that I think is equally as important as to why the specific Star Warsification of Lord of the Rings is just wrong. Now, we don't know exactly what they're planning to do in terms of this Star Warsification, but we know they are restricted to the Third Age, and there seems to be a great amount of hesitation to just cranking out a whole new trilogy of Fellowship, Two Towers, Return of the King. Let's be honest though, in today's day and age, they would break up each of those books into the two sub-books within them and would have 6 movies. Instead though, there seems to be this focus on taking individual characters from Lord of the Rings and giving them their own movies, as if Aragorn is somehow a character that can get a treatment like Iron Man. Spoiler alert. Not at all. I mean, this is something we've started to even seeing happen within Star Wars to very mixed results. And again, Star Wars characters are not as specifically tailored and designed for the one story they're involved with as Lord of the Rings characters. Aragorn, in my subjective opinion, as a character, you get 100% of everything you could possibly need from him from the first time he appears in Fellowship to the end of the Return of the King. Because there is a start, a fabulous execution of development, and then an incredibly cathartic end. And if you go and take a writer who is not Tolkien and just start shoehorning in audience-pleasing things earlier happening in Aragorn's life than The Hobbit, what are you adding that's actually beneficial to the artistic ideas behind the character? Nothing. And excuse this comment, but as a fan, it makes me extremely nervous in the day and age where we are consistently getting rather boring fantasy adaptations that are not written on a level that I think many of us have come to expect great shows to be. To hear that something as highly respected as Lord of the Rings and characters as delicately crafted as the Fellowship could be getting a similar just run through that in the end, yeah, isn't going to do a thing where it destroys the legacy of Lord of the Rings or anything that dramatic, but it's just deeply unpleasant to see done to something you really care about. Think of your favorite book. Now imagine if a writer you specifically didn't like was given the option to take a random character from it and just give them this whole backstory that's going to become a part of the conversation for that character indefinitely afterward. If you want additional proof that this kind of just arbitrary expanding to random elements within the Lord of the Rings universe isn't necessarily conducive to modern cinematic storytelling, you don't need to look any further than the most recent Lord of the Rings adaptation made, Rings of Power, which, yes, has its fans and its over-the-top haters, but overall the consensus seems to be that it was just rather disappointing and particularly boring, especially on the character level. Bless you, Kayla! And well, yes, Third Age is certainly different than Second Age. It's still a similar practice of taking small nuggets of ideas that Tolkien clearly had from his characters and just trying to expand upon them in these grand ways to then try and carry an entire show or movie. That doesn't seem like a very sustainable way to explore Middle-earth, in my opinion. Hey, writer's room. So guess what? Exciting news. We just got the rights to Tolkien's Third Age. I know, better than having the second or first, absolutely. But a little bit of a hitch in the road. We can't just retell the Lord of the Rings movies. So instead, I thought it would be fun if you just pick at individual, extremely well-known characters and just start telling some spin-off stories, right? Those are always fun. No, you can't violate canon in any way, shape, or form. And no, developing the character is going to be a little bit of an iffy space as well because they need to align with the character we meet in the books. So while telling like a Legolas prequel, just make sure he doesn't speak to too many hobbits, because that would really violate his character with the fact that he doesn't speak to Frodo much in the movies. No, I haven't read the book. I'm an executive. How dare you? Anyway, don't worry, everything's fine. Now I'm gonna get back to work talking to today's sponsor, Wraithmarked. Bryce said I could get mean for this one, so if you don't listen, I'm gonna punch you right in the cuticle. Because this video is brought to you by Wraithmark Creative's brand new Kickstarter for a deluxe edition of Sufficiently Advanced Magic. That's right, do you remember way back in the day when you all hounded me incessantly to read this book and I said, yeah, it's pretty good. And for those of you who don't know of this book, it's an indie book that actually managed to to get its way on the New York Times bestseller list, and while it's not that impressive anymore for a trad published book to get on the New York Times bestseller list, it's incredibly impressive for an indie published book. But there's a reason I've chosen Wraithmark Creative to do my own deluxe editions, because with this bad boy, you're going to be getting a 2-piece cover with unique art on the front and back of the book, a leather spine with, of course, that gold stamped foil and a gold gilding on the page edges and an attached ribbon bookmark, high quality offset printing, and a custom interior design with embellished chapter headings. That means you can get it all touchy on it. Full color end sheets and at least 10 unique interior art pieces. Because, you know, more of you that back it, the more art they get to put on in there. And of course, this provides a great opportunity to grab any previous deluxe editions that Wraithmark has worked on, including the Sword of Kaigen, which was a banger hit for them. So if you're interested at all, check out the link down below and back the Kickstarter today. Back to my angry rant. Now, there was one counter argument to this that I came across that did initially actually give me some excitement and put me on board with some of the people who are saying this could possibly be good, and let's just be excited, and that's that apparently Peter Jackson, to some extent, is going to be involved with the development of this continued exploration of the Middle Earth. And Peter Jackson, I mean, yeah, he's had a bit of a rocky career as a director, not knocking out of the park every single time, but when it comes to his love of Middle Earth, there are few people who are going to be as respected as him, especially since he has been open and honest about his regrets with the Hobbit trilogy. If he was still trying to defend those, I would be like, come on, man, okay, maybe I don't want you actually getting involved if you can't admit mistakes were made. But he seems to be very vocal that he was screwed over by the studio. There's all kinds of stuff he'd want to change. And that, yeah, okay, he seems to be someone that I still do believe understands Middle Earth. Except he doesn't seem to be getting involved out of some just need creatively to add something into Middle Earth, similar to his initial incredibly long pre and post-production and delving into the original Middle Earth trilogy. But it's even stated here he's more specifically deciding to get involved because he was frustrated with how many people were assuming he was involved with Rings of Power. To be perfectly fair, I am reading that as negatively as one could, but if you've seen recent interviews with Jackson, he does seem to be kind of just on this frustration kick recently, and it doesn't seem like the healthiest mentality to be jumping back into Middle Earth, in my impression of recent talks I've seen him have. I love Peter Jackson as much as the next Lord of the Rings fan, but I don't think frustration is the best motivation to get involved with a several years long project to go ahead and continue adapting Lord of the Rings. So this kind of gets me into the specific wording around the Star Warsification and how I think this is actually something they have said and is extremely poignant in a way that may not be intended, because I actually think they have the potential to Star Warsify Lord of the Rings in a terrible way. Because let's think about when Star Wars was initially released. That trilogy did something very similar in my mind to the actual initial book release of Lord of the Rings, or even the Middle-earth trilogy that Peter Jackson put out. As I said before, those were groundbreaking for their time. Some people argue Tolkien invented epic fantasy with the publication. Peter Jackson's trilogy of movies won all of the Oscars because it just pushed the bounds of what you could do for VFX, raising the bar. And Star Wars, the original trilogy, was a space epic unseen before, especially without adaptation inspiring it, just George Lucas's rather overt influences, and it was special. But I don't think many people are going to argue that Star Wars, in terms of always being something that's pushing bounds or revolutionary, is special anymore. Yes, there's some really cutting edge VFX, but we're in the day and age where if something doesn't have flawless VFX, it'll inevitably be brought up in a review. That's now the standard. And while Star Wars still can have quality entries, it's undercut by this constant push for just more money, more eyes, more views. And Lord of the Rings, we have already seen step into that territory with Rings of Power to souring results. And yeah, if they're planning to just start cranking out Aragorn origin movies or just redo the main trilogy for some reason, it could have a similar result, where instead of it feeling like a big deal, a special event when we're getting some kind of push for an adaptation for Lord of the Rings, which even if you hate Rings of Power, it was a big deal when it was being done. But now I just have this picture in my mind where I have one of those soulless MCU Phase 5 timelines, but instead of Iron Man. It's like the Merry and Pippin crop harvest followed up by Legolas's adventures with Gimli somewhere. And if you want to make fun of me for wanting that for just something that's as simple as a book series, I get it. I am absolutely being an over-the-top nerd who is passionate about something. But I think that's why 500,000 people nearly have subscribed here on the channel. It's okay to have IPs, ideas in literature, authors who really affected you as a person. And I think it's somewhat natural to feel protective over those stories as fans. It's a part of the whole death of the author argument. This is a complex topic in terms of why it gets such strong emotional responses to people. But this brings me to my closing point here. The reason people were excited when the original Lord of the Rings trilogy was made into movies was because it felt like we were going to be getting a visual representation in the truest way possible into Tolkien's imagination. People were spending years of their lives developing the smallest bits of detail for those movies to help immerse us in what is proven to be one of the most expansive and deep worlds ever thought of. Off of the coattails of that incredible effort that had monstrous success, it seems that those in Hollywood who must keep the money machines printing are hoping to ride that wave of success into higher dollar amounts, despite the fact that for us as fans, that vision into Tolkien's imagination has already been given to us, and anything that comes after the fact is clearly going to be expanding on ideas that do not need that level of expanding because Tolkien himself did not do it. A man who had a long history of trying to get adaptations done, but also having a high standard of who he worked with and what he greenlit. And what's infuriating to me is I personally know so many authors who have written incredible books with their brilliant imaginations that also deserve to be shown to us, the fans, and to wider audiences who might then find great inspiration from a new look into a new world that has not been brought to the live action or animated for us before. Robin Hobb has never had a live action adaptation that has lived up to the awesomeness that is the Farseer trilogy. Brent Weeks' Night Angel would be a money printing machine to a fantasy teenage audience, but of course has never been touched because it's not a proven IP to give us just billions of dollars in the box office, because why would you make anything that can't promise $1 billion? Malazan, Book of the Fallen, has respectable voices within the fantasy community claiming this might be truly a fantasy world larger and more impressive than anything Tolkien made. Never going to be adapted in this way because it's not a proven IP who's going to give you $1 billion. Red Rising, if done well, I genuinely believe could be something that reaches a level of popularity that is on an MCU level due to its incredibly approachable entry into the world and then its bombastic explosion into being a sci-fi war epic with characters that anyone and everyone would come to love, and a class system that inherently draws people in to be like, oh, I'm a pink, which is one of those commercial gimmicks that absolutely people in Hollywood would drool over. But it won't be done anytime soon because it's not proven to bring you $1 billion. So as someone who spends their livelihood reading, digesting, and monitoring these stories, I am just tired of seeing the same IPs get the same treatment and desperately waiting and hoping for someone out there to have the creative desire to push for something that is not yet proven to be $1 billion printer and fight like tooth and nail while series that have already been given what is widely considered to be a perfect adaptation, put it to rest, is milked until the nipple bleeds.